There we go. There it is.
All right. Thank you. I want to welcome everybody to the presentation on China's Belt and Silk Road Initiative. And this is being presented by Linda Gerber today. Let Linda take it away from now.
Okay, thank you, Alice. I want to make sure everybody online can hear me, and I'm pretty sure I'm speaking loud enough for the folks that are in the room. So thank you all for coming for this. I'm pretty pumped about it because I haven't updated this material in a while, so I learned a lot from it. And as I was just telling folks, I thought I was going to get to rehearse this in my class this semester, and I didn't get to because we ran out of time. I teach international trade and investment at University of Texas in the business school there, and I love the subject matter, and I love to learn new things. So let's go ahead and jump into this. And so first off, let me give you a quick overview of where we're going to be going today. And first off, I want to give background. One of the things my students learn very quickly is I never like to just talk about where things are now. I believe in an evolutionary perspective. So I want to give some context for the Belt and Road Initiative that I think will be helpful in understanding it. And then we'll talk about the basics of the BRI, what's in it, how is it financed, and how many countries are involved. And then we'll get into the question of impact. What's going on now? What's the status? What's the upside? What's the downside? And I want to encourage you guys, don't wait till the end to ask questions. Feel free to just raise your hand or flirt, okay? So go right ahead and ask anything you want. And then we'll end with the question of what's the future of the Belt and Road Initiative. So first off, this question of what is the background? And got a mouse there. I think it's important to think about China's long-term history. And when I say long-term, I mean long-term, because I think it helps you understand the goals of the BRI right now. Now, this is a pretty complex graph. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it. I'm not going to deconstruct it like I would if I was going over it in class. The important point here, my clicker doesn't show on the screen there. Well, let me see if I can yes, there we go. So this line is China, and this goes all the way back to the beginning of the AD period. So back to year one, and you can see China was very important in the world up until 15 to 1700s. And then there was a pretty steep decline and then growing again. And now this only goes up to 2001. So as you would imagine, its ascent is pretty important. Now this is share of global growth. It's not, size of GDP or anything like that. It's how important are these various regions of the world at different points in time. So obviously China has been really had highs and then lows, and now is somewhat on the ascent again. Again, this is another one of those graphs. It kind of shows the same thing as the other, but it goes back to year one, and I have a green clicker and it shows up on the screen, which I'm sorry I didn't bring it, but this is the United States. So you can see Great Britain here was important, and Japan had differing points of importance, but here is China, and you can see very important back in the day, a few hundred years ago, and then lost its importance, and now you see that relative share, relative balance of power shifting, and China now is pretty much the same size as the United States.
Can you get any volume out of this?
Was that somebody online asking a question? Yes. Okay, moving along then. I want to kind of hear what let you hear what some scholars, Chinese scholars, have said about China's historic role. So in the 1600s, the quote is, China was the largest and most sophisticated of all the united realms on earth. It's pretty high praise. During the Ming Dynasty, China held wide influence, partially because of the boom in global trade. So I emphasize the idea of trade here because that puts it in the context for today. At one point during the 1400s, China ruled the waves. You know, it wasn't Hail Britannia. There were Chinese ships and captains that were very aggressive in pursuing shipping channels as well as exploring the world. And then trade made China rich, according to this scholar. And then this is an important one, I think. It was trade and the growing shortage of silver that led to the Opium Wars and the decline of the Qing Dynasty. And that marked the end of its golden age. And here's what I think is important. The so-called century of unequal treaties. So the idea is China ruled and then they got snookered by some unequal treaties. So I think that's an important part of the context here. What I think we're seeing now and have been seeing for some time is China's quest for renewed greatness. They see themselves as a rightful superpower. And I don't want to take that too far, and you'll see in a minute. But certainly this predates China's entry into the World Trade Organization, the WTO entry, when China's economy really took off. But this was part of a longer term strategy for developing more importance economically in the world. And of course, the inspiration for this was the Silk Road that goes back 2,000 years ago and really was important for putting China on the map as a major trading power, political power, economic power, and so forth. The Belt and Road Initiative is widely known in China. Everybody knows it and everybody supports it. So this isn't something that's just like a top-down idea from the Chinese government, although most of what they say is taken by the Chinese people and followed. I had a student that's from China that was in my office this weekend, and this week, actually Monday, we were talking about the class and other things. And I don't know how it came up, but something about business practices. And she said, it's so strange to me because in China, if the government says do something, everybody does it. They just do it. Whereas people don't do that here. I thought, yeah, no kidding. You've noticed something very true. And so she was talking about businesses try to avoid regulation or maybe cut corners, and the same thing with COVID protocols and so forth. And so her observation was it's not a dissent environment, even though of course there is dissent. It's not the way things are typically done. And being a collectivistic culture as they are, there is this sense of we do everything together and we try to promote the welfare of society. And that's a primary motivation for a lot of people in China. I would say the majority. I don't think that China's motivation is anti-US. I don't think they say, we want to become powerful and squash the United States. They just, I think, tend to say, we want to be powerful, and if you get in our way, then we'll try to push you out of the way. But our objective is to be a superpower and to have enormous influence and control, but we don't need to take you out to do that. We just don't want you to get in our way in order for us to achieve our goal. There's also this lingering thinking, I think, that the reason that China lost its preeminence was because they were they were thwarted by other foreign powers. So the Silk Road was shut down by the Ottoman Empire. And so this was a source of their greatness, and then the Ottoman Empire shut it down. And then, of course, Britain took it after the Opium Wars, gained control and got concessions. The Japanese and now the US are powers that have stepped into the way of their rise to power. So I think that might be part of the backdrop there. But I think what all this has led to is a win-lose mentality on China's part. And this is something like, if you came to my last lecture when I was talking about trading environment of in the world today, one of the points I made is, I think around 2001, we had a real shift in the thinking about global politics. And I think if you think about the post-World War II period, it was pretty much a collaborative model. It was win-win. If we all work together and create fair rules and fair trading, everybody will succeed. Now, not that everybody always acted that way, but I think that was the mindset and the philosophy. I think once China joined the World Trade Organization, I think their mindset is more win-lose. You know, we're going to win this, and we don't care if other people lose. It's not that we're going to rise together. And I think that has increasingly influenced the way lots of countries in the world operate. And I think there's a reason for it. 9/11, other things that were going on in the world as well. But that, I think, has now become more of a standard mode in the global economy. So what's China's intent here? And there's differences of opinion on what China is trying to achieve. One belief is global domination, right? They want to run the world, and they don't want to have to answer to others there. And James Mattis, former US Defense Secretary, said that there should be many roads and many belts, not one road and one belt, which is the essential premise of the Belt and Road Initiative. So they're saying, don't be trying to think this is going to be it. I think that was his point. There's a whole different point of view that says China's trying to solve some internal problems with the Belt and Road Initiative. And one is that in their haste to achieve rapid growth, they have created overcapacity, and they have created exuberance, unrealistic exuberance on the part of citizens that they're going to have greater growth and greater economic success, because there's still a lot of poor people in China, particularly in the provinces, and they have seen the wealth that has been created in the aftermath of China's growth after the WTO and so forth. So there's some resentment of that a little bit, and China has been very worried about the idea that there will be another uprising. I mean, this is a country that saw a revolution in the 19th century with millions of people left dead. And the Communist Party is only a small proportion of the overall Chinese population. So I think there's this fear of we have to solve our unemployment problems, and we have to create new opportunities. And if you think about the coastal areas is where most of the economic growth happened in China earlier. And then out to the west, the provinces didn't realize that. And so the test case for the Belt and Road Initiative was to move out to the provinces and create economic opportunity. And then that became the launching pad for the rest of the Belt and Road. So it was definitely focused, I think, on what are we going to do with our excess capacity? And we can box it up and ship it out to different parts of the world. And that's what some of this has been. But we can also ship our labor out. to other parts of the world. 3 or 4 years ago, Mike and I were in Costa Rica and just on vacation, but first there was this huge soccer stadium there. It was all built by the Chinese. And then the Chinese were building a railroad from the Pacific to the Atlantic to kind of be an alternative to the Panama Canal. So in case we ever tried to shut down that passageway there. And what the guide told us, I never verified this, but there were 2 million Chinese that have immigrated to Costa Rica. That's a pretty big segment of the population, if that's true. And what they're doing is shipping out workers. They're not in China to cause problems. And, you know, who knows? If you think about the history of some other authoritarian regimes like Putin or Hitler, having diaspora in another part of the world that you want to have influence over is not necessarily a bad long-term political strategy as well. Now, is that what China has in mind? I don't know. But you definitely saw Russia sending immigrants into Ukraine and other countries, and we certainly saw it with Hitler with the Sudetenland and all that kind of thing before World War II. So this idea of moving our population out and then using that as a basis for expansion is a real strategy. Maybe the Chinese are doing that. And so this goes back to this idea of unemployed labor can be a risk. A few years ago, I heard some quote when the US was criticizing China over some policy or another. And the quote was, I think, from the foreign minister, but they said, we need to be wary of things that upset our citizens in the province. And the underlying message was, don't try to push us to change our policies because the outcome could be worse than you would fear. And worse than we would fear too, because we could get this uprising. So economic development, economic growth has been really existentially important for China's point of view, or the Communist Party, to make sure that they don't face rebellion, another revolution. Let's see. I think another intent is they just don't want to be as subject to US control. And they are in certain respects now. So the South China Sea is an area where China is really trying to exert more control. They built islands with military bases on them in the South China Sea. And here's just a little map that kind of shows you the region there. And this is the main, forget my flicker, so here's China. And this is the route that shipping lanes have to take to get out of the China Sea. And a lot of these countries claim control over certain regions of it, but there's also a lot of oil fields that are undersea oil fields. And so China definitely wants to exert control there, and they do not want the US messing in their frame of reference or their power hierarchy. I've already talked about I'm sorry. I need to fast forward through here. I got my clicker went to the wrong place.
When did China get into WTO?
1994. No, 2004.
So it's a decade after NAFTA.
Yeah, exactly. I was just talking about NAFTA, so that's probably where the 94 got in my head there. But yes, 2004. All right. So now to this last intent. And so this idea that China wants to not prevent, but at least doesn't want to be under the control of US economic and military dominance. They want their own sphere of influence, and they don't want to be curtailed by anything the United States does or wants them to do, or other powers in the world. Another thing that I think that China has really paid attention to with the sanctions against Russia is the way that the US and other allies, but particularly the US, have tried to control the international financial system through the SWIFT payment system. And that's not really a payment system, but it's a communication system among banks that makes it possible to transfer funds. And the US has put a kibbutz on that for Russia. And Russia saw that after Crimea and tried to reposition a lot of their financial systems. But I'm absolutely sure that China is already setting that up. So they will not be subject to the United States at some point. So there's lots of history here that goes into what's happening with the Belt and Road. Oh, and I would also mention, China thinks South Korea and Japan are their sphere of influence out there, right? But the US has very historic influence in those countries. And so that's another thing that I think maybe shapes China and their ambitions. And one more point there is we don't really know about any of these because there's been pretty pervasive lack of transparency in a lot of what China does. They kind of play their cards close to the vest. And I think we do to some extent as well. You know, we don't lay everything out on the table in terms of our long-term intents. But I think China has much greater sense of long-term strategic plans than we tend to have. And so we have to kind of read the tea leaves on there. No pun intended there. Okay, so as I'm saying, very much the Belt and Road has both a strategic and a long-term perspective. And if you go back looking at China 30 years ago, you can see a very deliberate progression of policies that change over time as necessary to China moving further and further towards their economic goals. And I would say, while it's strategic, they're also very opportunistic. So one of the things I found out as I was doing some reading here that I thought was very insightful is after the financial crisis in 2009, Xi, who was not the chairman then, he was vice chair on the Politburo or something like that. He made a major trip to Latin America. And he visited all these South American countries. And apparently the message wasn't at the time, a lot of the economies that had been hurt by the financial meltdown blamed the US for it. The guy who was the president of Brazil at the time, named De Silva, he was quoted as saying, the financial crisis was caused by white-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people from the United States. How's that for an incendiary comment? But I will also say for context, Latin American politics is always very flamboyant. I mean, wouldn't you agree, Mary? You know, there's all these, the head of Brazil used to tour with a parrot that wore a red beret and sing together. So, you know, you can see all sorts of stuff in Latin America. But, and it was probably a lot of political posturing, but the message was our problems are due to the United States financial irresponsibility. So I think a lot of the groundwork for what's happened with the Belt and Road Initiative in Latin America was established early on. And that's why I say he was opportunistic in that situation. Xi has become a very powerful leader, and the Belt and Road Initiative is his ballgame. Absolutely. He came into power in 2013, and that's when the Belt and Road Initiative was announced. So this had been planned all along. Once he was in power, he got rid of all of his opponents. He only has loyalists, and then he abolished term limits. So the Chinese leaders had a 10-year term limit sequence, and now they don't have any more. So he's, as long as he can hold on to power, he's dictator for life,
Yeah.
basically. And there's all sorts of other things they've done. Maybe we have time at the end, we can talk a little bit about the way that China consolidates power. They have, one little thing I mentioned, the word up there, but there's residency permits. And you cannot travel across the country without a residency permit. And illegal aliens cannot get jobs except backdoor jobs, illegal from one side of the country to the other. And they cannot receive any social services, no education, none of that kind of thing. So they really keep people, you're not going to have agitators going around the country.
Well, they've got the social score.
Oh, that one, yes. You want me to mention that or you want to talk about it?
No,
It's
go
fine.
ahead, go ahead.
Well, they have something that I always say it's analogous to a credit score, but it's much more comprehensive than a credit score. So it's a system whereby individuals are rated in terms of basically their social acceptability. And it's not just their behavior that determines their score. It's their friends and family. So if their friend does something bad, their score goes down. So the social pressure is just incredible. Fortunately, we don't have that Jill, or you act up and I'm in trouble. Right? No, but I mean, can you imagine a system like that where there's so much pressure? If you act out of line, you not only hurt yourself, but you hurt all the people around you. So it really gets conformity. Is there something else?
Well, I was just gonna say, we're looking at the ESG scores here, so. The what? And
Environmental, social, and governmental scores. It's a financial thing.
okay,
We should talk about this afterwards.
Yeah.
I went to a lecture on it this last
Okay,
week and I thought it was really fascinating.
Yeah,
We'll have to update on that, yeah.
Okay, anyway, moving right along. Yes, we do have the scores, but those are for businesses. Really? Okay, I'm looking forward to hearing about this. My education continues. Okay, let me talk to you about the BRI. And basically, it is an infrastructure program, a long-term strategic infrastructure program. And I'm going to show you a couple maps here that sort of show the route. This was at the development plan at the original initiative. And the blue line is the belt. That's the overland routes. And the red line, makes no sense, is the road. Because that's all on ocean. But the road is ocean, the belt is land, okay? So it must be different Chinese words, I don't know. But at any rate, but you can see how comprehensive these linkages are. And this is the most recent iteration.
wow.
And look at all the ports around Africa. It's gigantic. It also goes down to New Zealand, and I'll show you in a map in a little while that it really goes almost everywhere in the world. So you have all these ports, you have energy stations, you have oil pipelines. So I'll go back to the list of the kinds of initiatives that are involved there. So lots of land transport, lots of seaports and sea capability. Airports are included. Also power plants, both fossil fuel and clean energy. And as you'll see, I'll just say it now, the latest iteration of Belt and Road is she is moving away from fossil fuel energy. I mean, it can only go so fast, but they're trying to be more green in the Belt and Road initiatives. Lots of oil and gas pipelines that are in there for energy, lots of telecom networks. So it's very comprehensive. It also includes military bases. So there's, it's not just an economic principle. And I'm sure, I have not seen this anywhere, but I'm sure if asked about the military bases, it would be to secure the shipping lines, right? To secure the supply chains that are out there and the facilities from terrorism or whatever else. So that's kind of the essence of it. So where does the money come from for all of this? And the projects are partially financed by the members, those countries that sign on to the BRI and dip into their national coffers, as well as generate revenues. So there's port charges if they own the ports, transportation charges, pipeline charges, and so forth. So that's one, but a large amount of the activity in the BRI comes from loans, and partially from the Chinese government, but also from Chinese development banks. And I'm sure all of you have heard of the World Bank, right? And the World Bank was created as part of the Bretton Woods Agreement. And the idea was to provide low-cost loans to countries for economic development. Well, about 10 years ago, China decided they didn't want these countries dependent on the World Bank, which the US sets the leader of the World Bank. Instead, they need an Asia Development Bank and a Chinese Development Bank. And so that's where a lot of the funds come from. For the, they're not World Bank funds, they're Chinese development funds and some of the banks that they've developed. The World Bank estimated in 2019 that there had been $500 billion in investments in the Belt and Road. But recently, a publication, I think it's called Green Trade or something like that, but they estimated it was 4 million, and they trillion, sorry, and they very specifically said the World Bank said 500 billion, but we're saying it's a lot more than that at this point in time. So that's a lot of money, right, for developing this. And moreover, most of the funds run through Chinese corporations. So it's the state-owned enterprises. And one of the big ones is the Chinese International Trust and Investment Corporation, which is a huge conglomerate. And they have all sorts of different operations. And so they get hired by the countries that are involved to do the development work. And in fact, as in the case of Costa Rica, it's a lot of Chinese labor that's there as well. Mike and I were in Africa last summer, and in Uganda, there was the big road contract or road project going on. And our driver told us, oh yeah, that's the Chinese doing that. And there was a camp. They said, and that's where all the Chinese live who are doing it. And they bring them in their food and all of this. So very definite industrial parks that are being developed. Now, it didn't look like Chinese were actually doing the manual labor on the road, but still there was a huge presence there as well. And it's not just the CITIC that are doing the work. There's lots of other Chinese corporations, but it tends to be state-owned enterprises. There are some private, and particularly China has been encouraging, I think this is all part of this economic development, encouraging the small corporations from the provinces, from the Western provinces, to develop proposals. So that gives economic development where they want some economic development as well. This was interesting. William and Mary, College of William and Mary has a center, I think called Aid Watch or something. And at the end of 2021, they estimated that China was spending at least $85 billion a year on economic development initiatives. And just as point of comparison, the US is paying about $37 billion. So, you know, there is a disequilibrium there. But then we've had decades and decades of making investments when China wasn't making those investments.
Where do they really get the funding for their 85 billion from their economy? How do they do that?
Exports. China basically runs a surplus,
Yeah.
with most of the countries in the world, and they get settlements on the surplus, and then they have a lot of money to do that. But they have also gotten a lot of debt recently, as we'll see in a minute. So that's been part of the downside. It's, I'm telling you now, kind of like, I don't want to say it's good news, bad news, but the things that look a little ominous, but there's also some other things that suggest it's going in a different direction. So what are the successes? I already mentioned they did a dry run in the Chinese provinces, trying to build those kind of programs, and they were very successful. So they decided to keep on going. I don't know why my little clicker there was so much out of the way. It's kind of hard to say exactly how many countries are involved. The estimates are anywhere from 118 to 136 countries that have signed on. Here's the map, and the color codes show when different countries joined the Belt and Road Initiative, at least with a memorandum of understanding. Now, memorandum of understanding doesn't mean there's actually projects going on, but you're not going there unless there's some projects.
Yeah.
So notice how many countries in Africa are participating in this, and notice South America.
Yeah.
Right? And the most recent has been Argentina, that just signed a memorandum of understanding with the Belt and Road, and Costa Rica up here. But Brazil has kind of held out, Colombia, but most of the other countries have. India has not joined, the Scandinavian countries have not joined, and Australia has not joined. But, you can see pretty quickly, it's most of the places in the world. Yes, ma'am.
Just an example to confirm your comment. In 2010, I was traveling and taking UT students to Chile. And in the newspaper, there was an announcement that they had made a contract with the Chinese government to export 30% of their lithium for the next 17 years. And lithium is perhaps one of the most sought after chemicals. And I was in Myanmar and in Ghana in 2014, and almost every project that was going on anywhere in Myanmar, oil, building roads, building ports, it was all Chinese.
Yeah, apparently there's a
Same in Ghana.
gigantic port there that they built.
And they were building pipelines to the oil, which is inland, through the jungles. It's kind of heartbreaking to go there to see what happens to the landscape when these infrastructure projects go through.
The EPA is located over there.
That's right.
What did you say, kid? I want to.
He's evil.
Oh, okay. He didn't say that. He didn't say he was evil. Okay, but this gives you a sense of the scope of it now. And every continent in the world, but North America is included in that. I don't know when Mexico's going to sign a memorandum of understanding, but because the current president is not too crazy about the U.S. in general. But it really has led to significant transformations, just as Mary was describing it. Now we have these pipelines and ports, and the port in Malaysia, and it was run by CITIC, and they will run it for half a century. And the goal is 4.9 million containers a year, and it will match Britain's largest container port. So these are not, it varies how much it is, but there are some very significant large projects there that impact the economic development. So what are the downsides? As if you hadn't seen some. Okay, one is debt is a moral hazard. So these countries are taking on significant amounts of debt. And there was a port that was built in Sri Lanka, and they defaulted on their loan. China got the port, and they also got 69 square miles of land, Sri Lankan land after they couldn't meet their debts. And this has been a wake-up call for other countries as well who have to worry about that. There also is indication from some that the Chinese pressure participants in the Belt and Road Initiative to present surveillance information. What ships are coming in, what's being loaded, what's being unloaded. So they get a picture of what's going on in the world. And that just says that sharing traffic about what's coming through Sri Lanka. They have faced some problems, and one is the high debt that's been incurred. And 42 of the participant countries have 10% of their GDP in debt to China. And that's a lot. I mean, that's a very heavy level. They've also had significant corruption, and there are recent reports that 35% of many of the projects have had accusations of corruption and payoffs to government officials. I mean, this isn't unusual in the sense that when you have big infrastructure projects, usually there's government officials that get paid off somewhere along the way. But that has been a subject of criticism for China. There are nations who are starting to cancel their participation. But there is estimated that a lot of the money, the countries are now requesting renegotiation of the loans because they've gotten worried about being able to service the debt. They also realized that China, after the default in Sri Lanka, China got anxious about the criticism. I mean, China doesn't really, to some degree, it seems like, oh, we don't care what anybody else thinks, but they have to think about what everybody else thinks. And we kind of see that with Russia now. You know, they're not jumping in and helping Russia because they don't want to be linked with the international pariah there. So their reputation is important to them. And so some of the countries have been able to renegotiate some of that.
Lindy, what about their social control through I mean, they're controlling a lot of this by just the way they manipulate people. As they manipulate their own people, they're transferring them to all the other countries and interlocking everybody so that you can't say no and you can't quit and you're stuck.
When you have a lot of your financial future and your debt locked up with somebody, yeah, you're vulnerable to that and you can be pressured for that, for sure. Yeah, no question about that.
Well, they're trying some of that in this country. I mean, there's evidence of that.
There is. And we have had a spotty reaction to that. You know, part of our philosophy, like I talk in class about foreign direct investment philosophy and how open countries are to foreign direct investment. And we've always had the idea, hey, you got the money, you tell us what you're doing, go ahead and invest. But increasingly, the US is not letting certain parties that they don't consider to be friendly to access foreign direct investment. So the Chinese were trying to buy up a lot of fracking operations because they wanted to learn how to frack.
Texas.
And the US government said no at that point. And I don't think they've had success.
Well, they did. I don't know if they were successful in the end, but down near Del Rio, they were quite a large ranch.
Right, and I don't know the history of that, but my impression was they started blocking them from doing that. They blocking from access to advanced technology.
Yeah.
That's
They wanted to be near the Air Force base and they wanted to be near the Mexican American, flow of goods.
And, that is news to me, but it's not surprising. And when I use that thing about opportunistic, strategic, and long-term, and you can just see China exercising very long-term perspectives there. So one of the things that has happened is the investments have slowed down. And you could attribute that to the fact that they've gotten so much of what they wanted already, how many big opportunities are left there. But it seems that the Chinese banks are kind of dragging their feet on some of that. And the Ministry of Commerce in China says that the first 9 months of 2020, there was a 29% reduction in investments abroad.
That's a lot.
It is, it really is. The value of contracts in 2020 shrank by 17%. And part of the problem could be that Chinese debt has started soaring. So when you ask, where did this money come from? Part of it is they're borrowing money themselves, particularly with COVID, because their exports slowed down a lot. They had to spend a lot on COVID intervention. When you look at the films of what was going on during COVID over in China, I mean, they were spending massive amounts of money on hazmat suits and locking down people and testing and all of this sort of thing. So that we know how much we paid for it in the US. So that was really expensive. But anyway, they have very high debt per GDP. This is equivalent to Greece. Now, but they have a lot more opportunity to service the debt than Greece does. So that makes a difference. If you're a banker, I suppose you say, okay, I think China can come up with the funds to pay for it. And then, as I already mentioned, the cost of COVID. Then there's been the defaults. And then a lot of the countries that have participated have seen increased risk. They have put themselves on the line, and now they have to worry about whether these projects are going to be fulfilled. And one of the things I thought was really, the estimate is that 10 African and Latin American countries will have financing gaps of over 47 billion. So this is what they're getting from the Chinese. The Chinese are pulling back, and they don't have the money to pay for it. And I think one of the examples I thought was really interesting is in Kenya. The Chinese and the Kenyan government started building a railroad between Nairobi and Mombasa, and China stopped funding it 75 miles before completion.
Huh.
So
Wow.
they're sitting there with all this railroad that hasn't been finished. So who knows what's going to happen with that? But that starts giving other countries pause as well. And then, as I already mentioned, China is trying to become more green. And so their latest priorities for the Belt and Road Initiative is lower fossil fuels, trying to use more green energy. They're trying to control corruption, because that's been a black eye for them in this. And I think there might be one more thing going along with this. Certainly the debt plays a role, but over the last 5 years, it seems to me that China has increasingly implemented a China first policy. So there's less of an emphasis. We're not going to spend money on everybody else. We're going to spend money on us. And we've seen foreign direct investment curtailed because of that. Let's build Chinese companies. Now that we have the technology and the know-how and the capacity, don't let other countries do it and profit from it. We want to profit from it. And also we want to build our consumer market selling to Chinese corporations rather than foreign corporations. And so this could be part of that kind of shift in mentality there. Here's something that's very interesting. This was just announced last summer. The G7, and we all hear the G7 all the time, but the G7 stands for 7 governments, and it's the leading governments, economies in the world. I think the 7 are US, Canada, Great Britain, Germany, France, Italy, and Japan. And they meet every year, and they say, what are the big issues that we need to try to work on? And sometimes they're they have successful initiatives, sometimes not. And by the way, there's also something called the G20 that came up and hasn't been as active recently, but that's the G7 plus 13 other developing nations. So the idea is to bring the developing nations into the discussion as well. Although, like I said, it has not been as active. Well, last summer in the G7 meeting in England, all the 7 leaders decided to initiate a new competition for Belt and Road Initiative, and they pledged billions of dollars to it, and it's called Build Back Better World. That I'm not sure I'm crazy about their branding ideas. But if you see B3W, that's the new acronym for Build Back Better World. But they are saying they're going to spend billions of dollars. And it's kind of Johnny come lately to me. I mean, this started so long ago with China 9 years ago, and we're just starting to play catch up. It's like nobody real, of course, there were different administrations with attitudes towards China that were different. But it is, you know, we have a big road to follow if we want to try to combat some of the stuff that's going on there.
Wasn't that originally the purpose of foreign aid? And are we, you know, what's our commitment these days in foreign aid versus, you know, and that was always kind of a trap because the material had to be American, even though it could be money for the labor and whatever.
Yeah, well, that is what a lot of our foreign aid was. And I'm under the impression it's been cut back, but I don't know that for sure. That there's a far less foreign aid, but we were building loyalty and appreciation for America. Maybe after 9/11, I think, well, of course, we've had debt ourselves, but I think one of the things was maybe they don't all love us. Maybe that foreign aid didn't work as well as we thought it might.
And I think maybe after the Soviet Union fell apart, there isn't the support among the American public, really, that we should be
When there is
funding all these other things when we have plenty of need at home.
And there, you know, there's lots of concerns about government spending and debt and, you know, what do we buy for this? What do we get out of it? Anyway, well, that is the next to the last slide. Are you ready to learn to speak Chinese? I have the Chinese characters for ready up there. At least that's what Google told me. So I'm so glad you all have asked questions, but does anybody online have any questions or?
With respect to trade, China is developing the yuan and trying to become the world currency and digital currency. So how is that going to impact trade?
Well, one of the things, and I didn't add it in there and I should have, is that part of the loan paybacks are in imports. So you send us your wheat and that'll cancel out some of your loan, right? So that means they don't have to deal with dollars and so forth for that. So that's part of the initiative to become less dependent on the dollar. But I'll tell you honestly, I just showed this graph in class. If my computer was hooked up, I'd show you. But the level of reserve currencies in the world and percentage of total reserves. And the US has declined somewhat from about 62% over the last 15 years, 62% to 57%. So that's a pretty low level. Europe has gone from 26% to 20%. China has gone from 1% to 3%, actually under 3%. So the truth is they're just not close. Now there's so many elements to make a currency a reserve currency, one of which is no government controls over the currency, and the Chinese really do exert a lot of government controls. So I don't think anybody's going to want to go unless they're forced to use yuan to use it. And China tries to force people to pay for things in yuan rather than dollars because they want to take the dollar out of the economy. So
Yeah.
I think your premise is absolutely correct, but I don't think the mechanics are there at this time. I think it's a pretty long way off, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen.
What about, I mean, the CCP is China.
The Communist Party,
In a practical sense. So what does that mean to all these countries that are buying into their Belt and Road?
well, at this point, there doesn't seem to be any pressure to build
No,
up little
obviously.
communist parties elsewhere in the world. As long as they do their bidding, they don't care,
Yeah.
But in China, it's so, I have a student in my class who's from China, and he says, my father's a member of the Communist Party because he couldn't have his business if he didn't, right? And so anybody who has any influence is part of the Communist Party, but it's still, I think I saw something that like it's 1.5 million people out of how many billion? And I don't take those numbers as gospel, but it's just a small fraction that are in the Communist Party. But that's where, and one of the new rules for all businesses operating in China, Western as well as Chinese, is you must have Chinese party members on your board of directors. So you're not going to do anything unless the Communist Party knows what you're doing.
And do you sense any infiltration or any consequential in what, your academic world of the CCP?
Anybody that I deal with,
Well, not necessarily, but just what do you hear, or what are you seeing? I mean,
I don't.
you don't.
We have, in the LBJ school, which is the School of Public Affairs,
Yeah.
there are some China specialists. It was really interesting that there's this one guy he's a China specialist. He just about, knows what's under Chi's fingernails. He seems to know everything. But, sorry, that wasn't very nice. But he really is, to say he's suspicious of China would be to put it mildly. And the Chinese government was starting a center at the LBJ school that was Chinese American Relationship Center. And I went to the inauguration and he was just sitting there like this the whole time. They kicked him out. It became such a thing that we were accepting money from the Chinese government and that it would start influencing academic freedom and that kind of thing. So, but not that they aren't trying to do similar things elsewhere.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there was a guy who I shared an office with, maybe Lindy too, who was majoring in international business. And we all were interviewed by the FBI because he was a Chinese specialist. And in fact, when he finished his Ph.D., none of us have ever heard from him since.
He did go to work. No, it was because he wanted to go to work for the CIA as a China analyst. But he had a big picture of Mao behind his desk.
But the fun
I don't
thing
think it was
was,
because he loved Mao. I think
the fun thing was is that the questions were all about this guy who I'd shared an office with. Who does he hang out with? I have no idea. I mean, I didn't know it. He was perfect for the CIA.
because we knew nothing about
You run with those guys, don't you?
She says she knows nothing. She went to lunch with him every day.
Well, she's got some other CIA buddies.
Yeah. Any questions from the crew at home?
Remember to unmute.
Alice, do you see Dr. Hart's question?
Dr. Hart asked, what is the focus of renewable energy in China? Solar, wind, or nuclear?
All of the above. It's not nuclear. They're not doing nuclear, but lots of solar and lots of wind energy. But they're moving more towards gas as opposed to coal. And coal has been a major part of their energy source. And of course, that's pretty dirty energy. So Anything else? I hope that answered it. Any of the rest of you all?
I would just be curious in academics, as Ken asked, is there interest, a lot of interest among your students in what's going on in China?
Oh,
Or
yeah.
Where is the student interest?
That's a good question. That's a good question.
Yeah, it's big time. It's been very interesting to kind of watch it. My friend Beverly, Mary knows one of my lifelong friends, this is 20 years ago. I don't know that, not that long, but when her kids were getting ready to go to elementary school, she asked me, well, what language should they study? And I said, Chinese, that's where it's gonna be. I didn't think it would happen quite this fast, but the students for a while were all about China. Now, interestingly, during COVID, China didn't let anybody come. And in fact, it's been very hard for even business people to get in and out. They have to go like a 14-day quarantine at their own expense. And it's gotten really hard to do anything in China. So I've had several of the IB majors that were set to study in China and they have not been able to go. And I think the interest has waned somewhat because of that, because they've kind of figured out, can't really rely on those relationships. Apparently now, from what I hear, is Korea is the in country. They all want to go to Korea. They all want to get in Korean classes, probably, exactly.
It's the barbecue.
That's it. That's it. We should just have them come to Frederick. Anyway, so it changes all the time. It's not all Spain anymore. It's so funny. The students will say, well, I want to go to Spain, but I'm going to work in Latin America. And I'm like, no, then you go to Latin America. They just want a European vacation. Any other questions? Thank you so much for great questions and great.
We were in Costa Rica a month or so back and we took two little tours and the guys were really sharp and you could tell, because I started quizzing them about some of the Chinese. I think they're skeptical. I mean, I think people are. I don't know what the government's doing. Some
Well,
people are.
keep that money coming and they're not,
Yeah.
at least they're friendly, but yes, I think you're right. Nobody can see
They
that
would much prefer
influx
to
of.
have Americans investing than the other, I think.
I think that's absolutely natural. And it would be really interesting to see a survey of populations in these countries who have gone all in on the Belt and Road Initiative and see if people feel like it's an invasion or something else.
Well, they don't, most of them speak English to some level. And I bet there's not many speaking Chinese.
In Costa Rica or any, yeah,
They all
yeah.
speak English.
And so Chinese is not easy to learn either.
Well, now in Costa Rica, I think they require English or teach English beginning in the first grade.
That's one, and that's true in a lot of countries
Yeah.
anymore too. This idea that English won't be the lingua franca anymore is not
That's
true.
that's not true.
But I
Croatian
still think learning other languages is wonderful.
Yeah.
Because
Oh,
it's
yeah.
not,
No,
as somebody said to me, you can always buy in English, but you can't always sell in English. I thought that was a good marketing person for you. All right, well, I want to hear about the ESG, what you were saying. We have personal scores on ESG?
What I've read,
working on it.
the large companies are all buying into it. And Merrill Lynch, I have read, if you have an account at Merrill Lynch, you have a personal ESG score based on how you have invested your money. Yeah, so, yeah. And of course, and there's the talk of legislation to ban ESG scores nationally. Now, I don't know where that is, but we have ESG scores. All right.
ES.
Okay, let me very quickly tell you what I learned, and I don't know
Okay.
if this is
Yeah,
from an
that's okay.
expert in the area, but it stands for environmental, social, and governmental. And companies are rated based on their ESG. But the tendency is to think that means how good they are in terms of their environmental, social, and governance policies. It's not governmental, it's governance. But in reality,
Right.
it's a liability index. So to the degree to which your company policies and operations put you at risk for environmental, social, or governance lawsuits. So now, if you pollute like crazy, you're at more risk.
Right.
I mean, there's definitely correlation there, but it's not exactly what people think. And a lot of people are out there investing based on an ESG score and not really realizing that it doesn't mean this is a clean, responsible company or something like that.
Yeah, but I've read how the items that go into the score. And it's how many blacks you have, how many transsexuals you have hired. It is
That's probably part of the
that's
social
social
score.
part of it. And of course, the big question is who decides? Who makes up the
Well,
rules?
I
and
would
who
say-
decides?
If it's a liability issue, if you don't have any blacks, you're subject to a lawsuit. Simple as that.
Right off the top.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
How do we define transsexuals? Do we ask people when they sign up that they are transsexual or not?
How much time
I
do you?
mean, right now, when you sign in papers, they ask you about whether or not you're Spanish speaking or you're black or what, all these different transsexuals, not part of it. The ABCs of sexuality have not gotten into our question. So how in the heck?
Well,
are they
it's the
gonna rate-
DNA test they give you when you go to work.
I get that.
Boy, this topic got way.
You can't drop your shorts anymore.
Oh, gosh. Well, those of you who don't want to hang around, you don't have to listen anymore. Thank you so much for coming.